issues affecting Asia's animals, and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Asia for Animals Coalition podcast. I'm your host, Ngọc Anh, and today we have a very special episode focused on the topic that has been gaining significant attention globally: animals in disasters. Joining me is Mr. Altamush Saeed, an award-winning interspecies justice lawyer, activist, philanthropist, and professor. Altamush is a true trailblazer in the field of animal law and disaster relief, having founded Pakistan's first disaster zone farm animal shelter. He is also a founding managing partner at Pakistan's first dedicated animal and environmental law and policy firm, and co-founded the charity Doings Foundations, which works on interspecies justice. He is also a professor at the University of Central Punjab Law School, where he teaches Pakistan's first ever animal law advocacy course. In addition to that, Altamush has been recognized with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Trailblazer Award in Animal Welfare from the Humane Society of the United States, among many other honors. Altamush's work span across many areas, but his dedication to interspecies justice in disaster risk reduction is truly groundbreaking. Altamush, welcome to the show. We are honored to have you with us today.
Thank you, Nogan. I am actually more honored to be here today and discuss topics such as animals as victims of disasters and how we are going to create a space or a planet where we can all thrive and not just survive. So I'm really grateful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Altamush. You have been incredibly active in the field of animal welfare and disaster relief, particularly in the context of Pakistan floods and disaster across the globe. So before we dive into the specifics of your work, could you tell us what initially inspired you to pursue a career in animal law and environmental activism?
Thank you for that wonderful question. Well, it has been a journey, and that's what I would say. In my whole life, I've gone across a lot of things. Initially, I just want to be honest with my audience. I'm from Pakistan, and in this country, it's really hard to see animals. They're kind of invisible, and one of the major reasons for that is, of course, poverty and lack of human rights, because the way our system is framed or the way we see things, it is from a human mindset. And when there's a lot of suffering happening with humans, it's really hard to see beyond. So I'm not going to blame anybody, but I was a victim to this too as well. But because I wanted to be honest. And initially I was only doing human rights work, but eventually in 2018 I was rescued by a cat, which is a really funny story. I mean, I was not physically rescued. I physically rescued her, but she mentally rescued me. And she basically opened me up to a new world. And her name is Mao. She's actually sitting right next to me. She's asleep, and she's taught me more about animal rights than anybody else on the planet. So at that point, she came into my life, and I didn't know what even spay neuter was, which is something very common, we all know. But at that point, I didn't. So Mao went outside and came back pregnant, and she gave birth to 5 babies. One of them is sitting on my bed right now, and the other live with us. So there are actually more animals in my house than people. And Mao has continuously been my non-human mentor, and that's eventually how it started out. And in Pakistan, the first thing that we could see is, of course, companion animal abuse, which is very common in South Asia, even India, Pakistan, and other developing nations where street dogs are unfortunately treated really badly. Many times they're shot as a mechanisms to inhumanely control their pup, which does not work. And that is something I learned through the protests. And at the same time, I was going through law school. So because of Mao, I filed another petition at the High Court to basically close a zoo in our city. We were successful in it, actually. In 2023, the zoo was closed. But a compromise unfortunately happened where they said that the government said that they will renovate the zoo, make it better for the animals. And I really couldn't say anything there. So that happened, and the zoo is now opened up again. It's really huge, but I still think the treatment of animals has not changed because, I mean, it's a different topic. I don't want to go there, but I personally believe that if we want to see animals as the way they are, we have to see them in their natural environment. And no matter how many amazing zoos or prison facilities we create, we cannot ever see the animals as the way they are, which is kind of, the purpose behind having a zoo and rehabilitate endangered species. But that's been left behind for more human concerns, which is another topic for another day. But that's how it started out. And eventually I was working in COVID at that point, in 2020, I was still a student. And what we did was we led a mission across the country to help human beings. But at the same time, I started a small initiative to support companion animals because that's what I knew at that point. I'm just being very honest. So with restaurants closed, most of these stray animals relied on leftovers. So what we decided was to start a small campaign where we would, go give out food in our communities and our vicinities so these dogs and cats could eat. That's how I started, and it's still ongoing. Eventually, afterwards, a lot of things happened. I got an opportunity to do a master's in animal law and study in the US. Eventually, then I ended up with three masters for some reason. They're in human rights, international law, environment law, and animal law. I hope you see a pattern. So that's how my life kind of changed. And afterwards, in 2022, when the floods happened, we did even more amazing work while we were rescuing human beings. We set up this disaster zone facility to rescue farm animals, and we actually rescued 8,000 farm animals. I'm not sure you knew that, but that was the start. And at that point, I didn't have any expertise, but I wanted to do it. And as a result, I was in the field in the disasters, and I saw these animals as victims, and they had zero fault. So that's how I got connected to particularly to this area. And eventually I was able to connect all these three values of human rights, environmental rights, and animal rights. And that's my theory of change, which I basically term as interspecies justice, because I personally believe that we cannot have a thriving planet for humans if the environment and animals are not thriving, and vice versa. So it's for everybody. And when you basically see that you're connected, when you basically ask yourself this idea that why am I not alone on this planet? Why am I living with other life forms? Why are there animals around me? Why there's environment around me? We will come to realization that we are all dependent on each other and we have to respect those relationships. However, just acknowledging that those relationships exist is not enough. You have to understand that when you interact with another being, they have their own inherent rights. That's the justice part. And that's how the intersections have to be coming from a place of justice, where the rights of one cannot be taken away for the rights of another. So this balancing cannot happen. I know it's really, hard task to do it, but there have been some really good examples, especially in my own work, which I will share very briefly. But that's how it started, and it's been a journey. So human rights came first, then came the disasters and animal rights, and then when the floods came, the environment came in as well. And at that point, all of my masters and all of my education connected. So everything that I do is a combination of these three values, but from a justice point of view. But it all started from my cat, and I heard everything, everything. So back to you, for that wonderful question.
Yeah, thank you, Altamush, for such a simple but truly inspiring stories nonetheless. You have truly managed to connect all the dots, like Steve Jobs said before all those years ago. And we're very glad to have someone like you and other experts out there in Pakistan and everywhere around Asia to fight for animals' justice. So I would like to move on to another topic. And you recently posted about your experiences in the Sindh floods of 2024, where you and your team treated and rescued over 300 animals. Could you share more about these missions and the idea of seeing animals as a victims of disaster, not just humans? I'm sorry if I butchered the name of the place. Is it Sindh?
And then and it's in you said that correctly actually. So yeah, so the thing is, there's this one thing that we both need to realize, Locke. So the thing is, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, we used to say that climate change is happening, and the world is kind of changing. But now we don't. Unfortunately, we can't say that. What we can say right now is that disasters are happening. We're in that part of the age of the Anthropocene where climate change is no longer the reality. Disasters are. And just to plug in a very, important but scary fact, the United Nations Disasters Reduction Office says that by 2030, we will have more than 570 disasters happening every year. And the thing is, if you truly see and understand for nations in South Asia, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we are actually the most vulnerable to these kind of disasters. 40% of global disasters happen in Asia alone. People need to realize those facts. And why is it? It's mostly because planning is not there. We do not understand how disasters actually happen. There's a lot of processes behind it, and there's a lot of stages as well. And sometimes we often hear the word natural disaster as well. I will unpack it later, but these are questions that we need to understand. And unfortunately, the way we are brought up in Asia, at least, we are not taught to properly critically analyze these ideas. And as a result, what really happens is most of our responses, and this is true, and you will believe with me, is that whenever any floods or disasters generally happen in Asia, our response only comes after the disaster has already happened. It's always in the response phase, always. And we really need to question that. And what really happens as a result is that there are many organizations in the government. What they really do is they're doing political charity, Political philanthropy is basically an idea where you're showing people that you're there for them in such hard times. It is good. But don't you think you should be there in preventing the disaster from actually happening? That's something we don't understand and we don't acknowledge it. And as a result, what really happens is we all become victims of disasters. Humans, in a way, where we're not taught about these things, and animals, even much more egregiously. Because the thing is, the way our system works, 100% of the animals are not responsible for any disaster, while at the same time, they are all victims. And policies exist that further exacerbates their status. For example, in Pakistan, there is a policy available that if your animal dies in a disaster, you'll be given some funding. What that really means is that you're basically empowering the farmer, right? So that he has enough means to restart his life after the disaster. However, what you're really incentivizing him or her is that to let their animals die, right? So you can get that money. And this policy exists in many countries, especially the US as well, which is, kind of the most climate change causing country in the world. So they have this policy as well, and it's in the subsidies in the billions. But why that policy exists in Pakistan, I do not understand. Because there is another missing link that we do not, acknowledge. But I will unpack that later. But coming back to your question, it's a loaded question. That's why I wanted to give all of that information. Is that the Sen floods are something that didn't happen, out of the blue. These floods happen every year. And interestingly, when floods are not happening, droughts are happening, which is kind of quite the opposite of floods. So it's really weird, like you have intense water at one point and then you have intense heat at one point. And in both situations, people are suffering and animals are suffering right with them. So when these floods happen into 2024, alongside, helping humans, we did the same thing for animals. And this time we were much more prepared because we had our own disaster zone farm animal shelter, which is basically has been operational since January of this year, which was generously funded by Humane Society International. And it's basically our base where we are actually, unfortunately, running the country's first ever farm animal shelter as well. But the reason we called it disaster zone farm animal shelter was because we wanted people to acknowledge that animals are victims of disasters, because normally these situations are always kept aside. There's climate change work happening on one angle, there's disaster work happening completely in a different sphere. So these things become quite unconnected, and that's why we called it as such. And when these floods happened, we did the very basic things. It was not that hard. We basically had our trained veterinarians. We took them to these sites, and they basically evaluated the animals. So disease is another big problem. So the thing is, you cannot shift an animal unless you have already deduced that it doesn't have a disease. Because if you shift it into the farm animal shelter, there's a very high risk of zoonotic disease transfer, which is, COVID-19 and other issues that are happening across the world, something that's completely missing from such conversations. So what our veterinarians did on the first stage was completely making sure that no animals had any diseases. And that meant isolating them outside if needed. We didn't have that problem, unfortunately, so we were able to take them, we were able to treat them right where they found them. We got them the food, we laid it out, and we made sure that their veterinarian needs were met. And later we were able to work with the farmers whose animals these were to basically give them back, and so they could survive the floods. There is this one plug that I want to make here, is that the thing is, the way the system works, You will not find any farm animals just roaming around in Pakistan or any underdeveloped nation or developing nation, such as even yours in Vietnam, Philippines, Pakistan, most of South Asia, most of Pacific, because these animals, unfortunately, are considered as property or livelihood. So I mean, it's unfortunate, but if you want to save farm animal lives, you have to work with the farmers and you have to give them an incentive to let those animals live. What happens afterwards is, really unfortunate. I'm not going to go there, but I know the audience can understand what I'm talking about. But the thing is, in those disaster situations, those animals deserve to live and they didn't cause it, and therefore they should be protected. So that's kind of what we basically did, and the mission was a resounding success. It was also supported by Humane Society International as well, and carried out by Charity Dunes Foundation, the first national vegan or plant-based organization in Pakistan's history, which I currently run. Again, fortunate and unfortunate as this is the only first one, but we hope that we can change that in the next year. So that would be my answer. I hope that made sense.
Thank you so much. I really like it when you provide such a detailed background, explaining everything from theory, from the background informations in Pakistan to down to what you did for the project. It's truly inspiring and serve as a great basis for other questions coming your way in this podcast and will help audience understand your work better. So thank you so much. So, in your TED Talk a couple of months ago, you introduced the concept of interspecies justice, which we briefly touched on a while ago, that the well being of all species is interconnected. You also highlighted the need for this approach in disaster risk reduction. Could you explain more about this and how it applies to disaster scenarios like the floods in Pakistan?
Okay, so thank you so much for this question. So the thing is to help people understand what interspecies justice really means is basically it's actually 1,000 steps ahead of One Health. I know people understand One Health. One Health is a beautiful idea because it's a way to get there. But One Health is basically acknowledging that an intersection exists between humans, animals, and environmental health. That's it. That's the unfortunate part, but it's still really important. It's because even right now, we're not even at the One Health stage. And like the zoonotic disaster that we discussed in COVID-19, and the whole world knows about it, was how poorly animals are treated. And as a result, they became vectors, and eventually the disease transferred from animals to humans that spread across the world. So things are connected. That's really good. But the thing is, when these connections happen, what often happens is that we balance out the rights of one versus the other. And we all know whose rights will be more protected in such balancing acts. It's the humans, right? So because there's nobody to represent the rights of animals and the environment as well. But the thing is, I want to ask a very basic questions to my audience. If right now the environment or the animal perish away, they go extinct, what would happen to the human civilization? It would go extinct, right? However, if the human civilization goes extinct today, what would happen to the animals and the environment? They would thrive. Why is that the case? So if we basically acknowledge this, we are also acknowledging that human life is impossible without a thriving planet where animals are also thriving as well. So it's in best interest of everybody. However, when those intersections happen, animal concerns are always left behind. And what interspecies justice does is that it basically connects those intersections, but it recognizes that whoever you're interacting with, whether it be the environment, animals, or even, they have their own inherent rights. And you have to come with some kind of a solution that works for everybody, where the rights of one are not violated for the rights of another. And what that really does is that it connects this question to another important one that's unfortunately missing in DRR conversation. That is about the food system. So for those who don't know, 1/3 of our global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. And there was a study that happened at the Imperial College of London in 2022, right after the Pakistan floods had happened. And the study suggested that while we cannot exactly pinpoint what number, what amount of climate change caused those disasters, but they could identify was that because of this high global greenhouse gas emissions that are happening across the world, was the reason why the floods happened in Pakistan. And it is also the reason why other kind of disasters, especially something that is not natural, happened as a result of these incidents and actions. And which brings me to another question that we all need to ask. Often when we delve in DRR conversations, we hear the term natural disaster. I just mentioned that very briefly 2 sentences ago. Are disasters really natural? That's a question, right? And for that, if we want to answer that question, we have to acknowledge that disasters are not single occurrences. They're not singular events where once a disaster happened, you go in and do the relief part of the response part, which is kind of, how the industry or how the world defines it, because it gives the world an opportunity to do their political philanthropy, political charity. That does nothing. Because the thing is, no matter how much you provide, you're never going to be able to make the victims of disaster whole, no matter what. And you're going to leave them more vulnerable if you're going to keep following this policy. Because we have finite resources on the planet. And coming back to the food system, when we ignore the harms of the global greenhouse gas emissions, that is 1/3 coming from the food system alone, we're leaving out a major chunk of the conversation. And we're only being reliant on fossil fuels and other emissions. But we have to consider these as well, because 30% is a very big number. And at the same time, 50% of the global habitable land is just used for agriculture. We could use that for other things, such as growing foods directly, plant-based foods, and using them as a source of nutrition. Because what really happens is that when we grow plants and we eventually feed them to animals, which we eventually eat, almost 80% or 87% of the calories are lost. So what really happens is, if in simple terms, if you grow a crop that has 100 calories, for example, and you feed it to the animal, because of the process and the fermentation and how the agriculture industry works, only 17% of those 100 calories go back to the human being. 83% are lost, or more than 80%, to give a very basic number. And this is why we have food security problems. Because if we directly eat those plant-based rich nutrition, we would not have food security problems across the world. We will fix it completely. But of course, there are reasons why that is not happening. And because of the complete ignorance of the food system in DRR conversations, because of One Health and other issues, which are, kind of not acknowledging the inherent rights these other things have, most of our solutions always basically give rights to one species more than the other. And the result of that, what we're basically doing is we are legally creating disaster risk. So a question we really need to ask, even if we have the best DRR policy in the world, until we legally allow disaster risk to be created, how are we actually going to move forward? That's the question. And that's something Interspecies Justice tries to eliminate. And therefore, everything we do in Pakistan is interspecies justice. So if we do something for the animals, we will do the same thing for the human beings. It's not just that we are animal rights, we are for rights for everybody. And they have to happen at the same level. And to just give you an example of what interspecies justice really looks like, is that in 2019 or 2020, we started these clean carbon neutral water projects that were for both humans and animals. And we were able to install over 1,500 of these across the country. Since last year, we have expanded the same project to use that water from our solar plants to create these green vegetable gardens across the country. One of our projects was actually in the middle of a desert, and installing green vegetable garden in the desert solved the food security problem of that community. It also makes sure that it's a diet change project, and it also eliminates the environmental carbon footprint that comes from animal agriculture as well, which was the reason why these floods actually happened in the first place. So these conversations are unfortunately missing from the DRR framework, and I'm hoping to basically work on them and include them in my next visits to the UNDRR conferences, and hopefully I can learn their language and give them something that they will understand. Because and that will only happen when we connect these ideas, that is interspecies justice. Because the other unfortunate thing that really happens is that because of our limited perspective, there are only a few things that we can think about. So if it's a person in Pakistan who is designing a DRR policy, for example, his vision would be completely focused on human beings. It would not even go to the environment. It would, maybe, but it would definitely never go to the animals. So he would, not because of his mistake or her mistake, he would leave out the food system. He would leave out the greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon footprint. and he would definitely leave out everything except humans. So it's not his fault. But the thing is, the world is designed, the way our thinking happens, and it starts very young from our education system when we go into first grade and move forward. We are always taught to think about human beings and nothing more. So we need to change that because what we're doing is we're hurting ourselves even more by causing these food security problems, by causing climate change, and also causing direct disasters, which actually result in actual loss of human lives. So it can be about the animals, it can be about the environment, and it can also be about the humans. Why not have it about for everybody? And therefore, we can all thrive, and we can also eliminate disaster from happening, thereby reducing the possibility of any harm taking place in the first place. That's my idea, and that's my solution. I know it's too utopian, but I think it's grounded in reality. And I'm working on some publications to put it on paper so other people can, take it move forward as well. So that would be my answer, and I'll give it back to you now.
Thank you so much, Altamush. You posed some very important and thought provoking questions and shed light on essential topics that we all need to ask ourselves and rectify. And we're very glad that you're working to introduce and promote this concept. And just a side questions, you mentioned attending the latest disaster risk reductions conference with the UN just very recently, a couple of days ago. And I was wondering if you think that there should be a need for the UNDR to collaborate with other agencies within the UN systems in order to truly address our planetary crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important question. And yes, I was very unfortunate to attend the recent United Nations Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction that took place in Manila last week on from 14th to 18th of October. It was an amazing conference because with every passing day, I was able to learn the language that there professionals speak across the world, so I can give them something that they would truly understand. So yes, within the UN system, there's definitely some basic collaboration. They already are doing it, but the unfortunate part is that it's very human centric. Because right now, the way our system is designed, we are not focused on prevention. We're focused on risk reduction. That's why it's called DRR, disaster risk reduction. It's not disaster risk elimination. So it's already designed not to ensure that disasters are completely eliminated. So that's how this theory is developed. And right now, under the UN system for DRR, they actually have a non-binding policy, which is the United Nations Sendai Frameworks for Disasters Reduction, which was developed in 2015, which is kind of like, in a way, it's binding because states basically accepted it and said it would be their responsibility. However, it's not a binding treaty, so it doesn't carry that international force of the law. So everything is happening because of what people or what states said. So the implementation mechanism does not exist there, and it's mostly about collaborations. And it's a good idea. Collaborations are really good. So, but within the UN system, there already are some really good collaborations happening. But as I mentioned before, they're very human-centric. So there's with OCHA, there is with UN Women, there's with the Disability Network as well, and the treaty as well. That's for the rights of disabled people. So a lot of conversations are happening around gender inclusivity, disabled people inclusivity. But that's kind of where they're heading at right now, and they're still not, achieved that purpose. So they haven't thought about the environment yet. Actually, they have in a way, but it's very much human-centric, and their current approach is kind of more about response and not about disaster risk elimination. So there's less focus on prevention and preparedness and more on response and recovery. And the way the UN Sendai framework is framed, the definition of the framework is basically supporting human lives and at the same time protecting their livelihood. So what livelihood really means is animals, but they're being termed as property. So direct presence of animals is completely missing from this framework. And as a result, the food system is also ignored. Which is something we really need to discuss and change. So yeah, That's how it's happening, and it's moving in a good direction because I think we should have more protections for women. We need to have more protections for people with disabilities, for persons with disabilities. We have to move forward in that direction. We have to include nature-based solutions, but it's still, more about everything is about human beings. As a result, we're missing out these key areas that are increasing more disaster risk. And a question that I asked before, I'll put it in here again, is that as long as we are legally allowing disaster risk to be created, how are we actually going to move forward? That is the question. Right now, we don't have an international binding treaty on the topic as well, which actually I heard about in one of the sessions that took place at the conference, that something of the like was actually being drafted right now. And a lot of people from Asia Pacific have been involved in drafting it as well. I heard the name ILC, but I cannot guarantee who within the UN who is drafting it. But a draft has been in the circulation for quite a bit of time. Is something that I learned from the conference. So that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Altamush. So you have managed to touch upon my other follow-up questions about some takeaways from the conference and some specific focus points from the conference. But I just want to ask a little bit more about the legal sides that you take away from this conference. How can we, as animal advocates, work together to ensure that animals are included in these legal frameworks? Maybe you can touch a little bit more and share with us your vision for the next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we have to acknowledge and understand the way the DRR framework works. So for that, firstly, we would need to read the UN Sentai frameworks, so we can understand what kind of language do these people actually speak. Because the thing is, no matter how noble our goal may be, if we do not speak their language, I'm not sure we will be able to convince them. So there are three things that are really important when it comes to disaster risk reduction. First, I'm just gonna, read off the definition, which is kind of, the outcome from the disaster risk reduction framework, the FEDA framework, which is about the substantial reduction of disaster losses and lives and the social, economic, environmental assets of communities and countries. That's the expected goal of the entire framework. And if we cut across the wording, it's about reduction, not elimination. So that's what they're interested in. And secondly, it's about in the lives of human beings and the economic and environmental assets of those communities as well. So the current language is anthropocentric, and we have to understand it and we have to use it in our favor. We have to be strategic and at the same time realistic. But there are a few other things that are part of the same framework that we need to include in our language. First is resilience. Second is vulnerability. Third is hazards. And the fourth is exposure. So resilience is basically combines some of all these values. But to explain that, I would go with hazards first. So many of us might confuse hazards with the term disaster. It's fairly common. It's not our fault, but there's a very stark difference between the two words. So hazards actually are the events. So for example, if an earthquake happens or if a flood happens, that's a hazard. But a disaster is something that's quite different. A disaster is basically an event that hurts. That is a combination of two values. One of them is exposure and the other one is vulnerabilities. So the thing is, disaster risk itself is how much exposure or how much vulnerability a community has. If we talk about exposure, what that really means is that are there any early warning systems available to inform people about how the disaster is going to happen if they can take actions? If there is some kind of a preparedness mechanism available that can reduce the exposure of a disaster in a particular area. For example, it can be geographical as well, because some regions are more exposed to these disasters or hazards happening in the first place. And those are things that you might not be able to control, but there are so many things that you can. For example, the food system. The amount of exposure the food system has is enormous, but it's completely ignored. And I think that's basically the area where we can bring conversations about animal rights in as well. Because we are speaking the language that people currently use. We are speaking the anthropocentric language. We're speaking the language that our experts are using, and we are putting humans at the center stage. that this makes sure that there are fewer disasters, and as a result, few human lives are lost as well. But at the same time, we would be able to talk about animals as well, and also about the environment, because they're interconnected. And the last thing that's part of the DRR language is vulnerabilities. So some communities will be more vulnerable than the others. And we think about human communities, and we think about women, for example, and persons with disabilities or children or the elderly. They are more vulnerable to the effects of disasters than able-bodied people. That's vulnerability. But at the same time, if we think about the animals, I think there is nobody more vulnerable than animals. But because of the way the Sentai framework is framed and the language that it currently uses, directly talking about animals is kind of really, really hard. And that is based on conversations that I had at the conference as well with other people who are working in disaster law, but not particularly with animals. But they said that the food system could be a good area to talk about these things. But based on what I went through to the at the event, I think we really need to speak their language as well, because they would not take us seriously without it. Those were kind of my major takeaways.
Thank you, Altamush. I think that you have managed to really summarize and simplify a lot of the complexities of engaging with UN agencies such as the UNDRR, and you've also managed to give us really practical advice on what to do. And I think that we would love to feature some of your knowledge and experience in our other resources from the AFA, so that more people can come to listen to you and learn practical lessons from you. Maybe it could be in videos or on another podcast, maybe, but we would love to be able to feature your content to the broader audience. So thank you so much. I think that I'd like to begin with another questions on financing and technology for animals, inclusive disaster risk reductions. So financing for disaster risk reduction was identified as a critical gap during the conference, especially in shifting the focus toward prevention and resilience. How can we push for more investment in, say, maybe animal inclusive DR, both from the governments and private sectors?
So I think it's a very good question, because with financing, we probably cannot do anything, right? And because the UNDRR framework itself is more of a promise between states. It doesn't have its own kind of a funding mechanism. We need funding from elsewhere. The UNDRR system, I mean, the body itself has its funding, of course, but not under the Sendai frameworks. And since we don't have any binding treaty on disaster law or some kind of a fund system that funds these kind of activities, we are kind of, very limited in terms of financing. Generally, the UNDRR system on its own has. So it's more or less taken away from governments, especially who are responsible for this DRR work. I mean, the climate change impact, but at the same time, from governments who want to invest in certain part of disaster stages as well. So a very key point that we all need to understand is that disasters are not singular events. They're not even natural. And this is where I will unpack the term. So, normally when we hear the term disaster, the term natural is coincidentally coming with it together. So we need to understand that there are no such thing as natural disasters. Because if we ask ourselves the question, don't we all actually in our lives create some kind of disaster risk? We do, right? With the food we eat, with the plastic that we, how we recycle it or give it away into the garbage, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that we do on a single individual level that piles up and becomes a huge number on the government level. Disasters do not happen, out of the blue, like one day you're doing good and the other day there's a flood. No, that's not how it happens. It takes a lot of time and it's a very long process. And so the first thing that we can do, which is, my advice, and I think everybody would agree with it, but of course there's less incentive to do this, because what you're doing here is, because when you say that you want to eliminate disaster risk or, prevent disasters, what you're really doing is you're taking away that legal right of the polluters to pollute, to create that disaster risk in the first place. Because if they don't do that, how do they earn their money? how does the financial system work? How does the world work? Because our economic system is reliant on creating disaster risk. That is something we really need to understand. And we're asking the same system to fund and finance DRR. So it's not in their direct interest to eliminate or prevent disasters. We need to acknowledge that and we need to understand that. And then we really need to understand is that because there are no natural disasters, we need to understand how a disaster actually happens and what kind of a cycle it has. So essentially, you will hear that disasters have 4 cycles. But the first one is prevention, the second is preparedness, the third is response, and the fourth is recovery. So it depends on which part of the disaster cycle you want to fund. The prevention cycle is not in the finance industry's incentive, but I think this is where you will have to spend the least amount of money to reduce the highest amount of disaster risk. Because the thing is, when a disaster has already happened, no matter how much prepared you are, there will be losses. And for those who are going to lose, they're going to lose everything. They're not going to be able to come back, no matter how much you do. And that losing everything part is going to be further exacerbated if you're living in a developing nation like ours, and especially in Asia. And so conversations about Asia particularly need to be highlighted, and people need to come up and talk about in which part of the disaster cycle which they like get more funding. Preparedness is actually less controversial than prevention because it includes early warning systems. It includes trainings and capacity building of people on what to do if a disaster actually happens. And it gives people, in some cases, some time to leave the disaster-prone area as well. However, because of the way the Sendai framework is languaged or the way it's written and how the way the world works, those things are only for humans. So the possibility of animals being left behind is going to be really, really high. In addition to farm animals, there is one area that we can work on that's companion animals, because many people are less likely to leave behind their companion animals when a disaster happens. And that is the case with the US as well. The example is important because the US actually has the world's first federal law that protects companion animals in the time of disasters, which came about in 2006 after Hurricane Katrina because people were unwilling to leave their companion animals behind, thereby putting human lives at risk. So the angle again was human lives, but it was very purposely and creatively used by animal advocates to push for that law. And a similar effort is being happening in New Zealand and Australia as well by some other experts too. So depends on what kind of animal you're working with. It depends on the cycle. And lastly, where you will get the most amount of funding is response, because people like to give away, billions of dollars when the disasters have already happened, because it helps build their own prestige image that they are the saviors of a community. I dislike that fact. It's a complete waste of money, but for those people, it's kind of political charity. So that's where the most money unfortunately lies. And I think that's the worst part of the cycle to invest financing in. And lastly, it's recovery, which now we are terming in the UNDRR world as build back better. That's basically creating policies where we do not create buildings or institutions that are in disaster-prone areas. We do not build buildings that have building codes that are prone to, fall down in case of disasters and things of the like. That's a good area to invest in as well. But my take would be to focus more on the preparedness part because of, the real life implications that are happening across the world. And I think that could be the most beneficial part for the animals. Of course, prevention is the best, but unfortunately, for reasons we can all understand, not a lot of funding is available in that area. So, yeah, that's how you can get funding, and that's how you can prioritize which part of the disaster you want to work with. You can decide which animal you want to work with. And then you can seek funding from crowdfunding, governments, the UNDRR itself, nonprofits, bigger organizations that are working across the world, like WHO. For example, if you work on eliminating disease risk, which also helps animals, again, connects the food system, that would be something that would be interested in investing because you're putting the human at the pedestal. So speak their language, use it, and come up with creative ways of protecting animals would be my answer to anybody who wants to, find funding or financing in this area. So back to you.
Thank you, Altamush. I just have a side questions. Like you have managed to really thoroughly explain the entire concept and also practical steps forward. But I was wondering if we can somehow also engage with development banks, like the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank. Somehow, do you think it's possible?
Yeah, definitely. I think the zoonotic risk is kind of an area that they're very interested in funding. They're very interested in early warning systems. So at this APMC DRR, the highlight of the show was early warning system for all, because I think you really need them, and it's tied away with technology as well, because it basically gives people an opportunity to take some action in the preparedness phase. And that's kind of, directly linked with the analogy that this gave you as how the disaster cycle is framed. So the Asian Development Fund back actually would be a better choice, because they're funding early warning system work right now, and they would be interested in funding disease risk elimination as well. They would also be very much interested in, I believe, in reducing the environmental carbon footprint as well, even though it might not be lucrative for other people. But I think if given to them in a language of the DRR world, I think it's a very good area to seek investment from the Asian Development Bank.
Thank you so much. You have also managed to touch upon some aspect on technology as well, like the early warning system. So I think I would like to move on to another discussion points about threats and opportunities. So at the conference, the systemic vulnerabilities, sorry, that exacerbate disaster risks, such as climate change and poverty, were acknowledged. So, how do you see these vulnerabilities impacting animals in disaster prone regions, and what can be done at the policy levels to address these threats?
Well, I think if you put the human being at the pedestal, you can literally do anything, because the way the system is designed, it's about human protection, lives of protecting human lives, which is okay. I don't mind it, but because that's how we are brought up, when we have to challenge these ideas and notions, that'll take time. So conversations like these need to happen. But exacerbating disaster risk, climate change, poverty. I'll add one more for you: food security as well, are problems that are really important to protect human beings. They're all, fortunately and unfortunately, linked to the food system directly. So I think there's a lot of potential, because at this APMC DRR, I did not see a single conversation around food systems, and I'm hoping to start something up. And actually, I would love your support, AFA, with it in a few months, so we can do something properly about it, because this conversation is completely missing. But let me make it easy, actually. And if you want to talk about disaster risk and everything else, and these are questions that I, also asked in my TED Talk. And these are fairly simple questions, because they help people understand what's it's all really about. So question number one is, how do we feed the expected 10 billion human population by 2050? And the other question is, which you asked me, how do we combat the effects of climate change and avoid disasters, and therefore ensure human survival? So while being a very selfish human being, the only way to eliminate or, ensure human survival is by preparing disasters. That's unfortunately the thing that's missing. And for regions like, let's go in Asia Pacific. Let's talk about regions that are even more devastated and be affected than, even ours. For example, Vanuatu and Tonga and those small island states that are, close to New Zealand and Australia. They're actually at the risk of completely being flooded completely. So they would not even exist. And I think, well, those people are bringing the fight as well. They were really heavily represented at the APMC DRR, which I really liked. And they talked about these traditional knowledge. They talked about women and their own knowledge, and they talk about people with disabilities and their roles. But in more particularly, they were, willing to champion that voice on making sure that their country actually survives. So that is a conversation that we really need to have, as to the disaster risk that we're creating in sitting in the US or in Pakistan or Vietnam. We are going to have an impact on other regions, and what we decide right now might decide whether their country exists or not. And I think at some point we need to talk about the collective survival of human beings. But the thing is, the only way to get there, we have to make sure that the environment and animals are thriving as well. Hence, coming back to the food system problem. And I think it could be a very good segue on eliminating disaster risk, or at least reducing it, and also increasing protections for farm animals in times of disaster and all kinds of animals actually. So yeah, that's that's a starting point. I'm still writing on this, and I'll be happy to share my work later with you as well.
Yes, that would be wonderful, Altamush. I think that throughout our podcast until this point, we've managed to learn quite a lot of information, really practical ones, and also learn bit by bit of how to understand and speak the language at UNDR. So, in your opinion, I was wondering if you can share with us your thoughts on the greatest opportunities for change that you see in our region, the Asia Pacific regions. Are there any particular countries or communities leading the way in inclusive disaster policy for animals?
Unfortunately, the countries leading these efforts are the ones that are most affected by it, because right now for them, they cannot do any development that causes more harm to their climate, because if that happens, they will cease to exist. So one of the major ideas that we really need to, combat and acknowledge is that of sustainable development, the SDG goals. The thing is, at some point, it ceases to be sustainable development because you've created so much disaster risk that it's impossible for that nation or the world to go back. So there has to be some kind of a check there. I mean, it's not a greatest opportunity for change, because I think it's very utopian. People would not change their ways, because if they cannot believe, how do they, make economic benefit out of things? But for me, the greatest opportunity to change, because I'm advocating for the animals, the humans, and the environment, was the food system. So I'm planning to set up something like at least an organization in some form, where we can invite other experts and speakers to specifically work on this issue in DRR. And the Asia Pacific regions, I think the best ones that we can target are the island states, such as Vanuatu, Tonga, and a few others. And we have to include traditional knowledge, because many of their web sessions at the UNDRR, APNCDRR were beautiful, and was about using traditional knowledge to solve disease problems that their communities faced in times of floods and other things. So there's a lot of knowledge that we need to tap in, and we need to use those people to basically champion this effort. Countries like ours can also be a part of that movement, because we've already suffered too much as well.
Thank you so much. Looking ahead, what is your vision for the future of disaster risk reductions in terms of better protecting animals, maybe over the next 10 or 20 years? I know that you have touched upon some of the opportunities and what we can do in the short to medium term, but in the next 10 or 20 years, what do you think should happen and will happen?
Well, if the way we're doing things keeps on continuing, and we're going to legally allow disaster risk to be created, I don't think we're going to move forward, because what's the point of disaster risk reduction if at the other point you're allowing disaster risk to be created in the first place? So you're not going anywhere. You're just playing seesaw, If you know that thing we had in our parks when we were young, the thing goes up and down, nothing happens. So that's where we're heading at. And that's where, with the way things are happening, we will face more disasters. And for the UNDRR itself, we only have 6 years to fix this, which is actually a very small amount of time. So a lot of things have to happen, and a major overhaul has to happen in all places. For animals, I would say, I think it would come from the food system, because of the egregious environmental harms the food system creates, and thereby creates an egregious amount of disaster risk as well. So if we become truly selfish human beings and we want to ensure our survival, we will at least think about the food system. And it's not just about animals, it's about all these three values: humans, animals, and the environment, because that's where we can truly thrive. That's where we can imagine a world where food security is a problem, where disease risk is not a problem, where climate change is not a problem, and disaster risk reduction is also not a problem. A lot to think about. And there are other areas as well, but I think we have to start with the most important one, because the most important one is causing us the most harm. And by food system, I don't mean just, land animals. I mean marine animals as well, because aquaculture has exploded in the last decades, 2, 3 decades. and there's still very minimal information about how disasters happen under the water. Because the thing is, for us, we might not see it, but a singular change of temperature in oceans, or a change in the pH levels, or other kind of a chemical, change in the water, would lead to the deaths of, I don't know, millions of animals, and it would disrupt the ecosystem to such an extent that it would take away the ability of the ocean to be a carbon sink, because our greatest carbon sink in the world are oceans, and if they lose that ability, uh, it's the end of the world, actually. So it's kind of really dark. But I think this is a really good way to make sure that we have a planet at the very least, for our future generations. So yeah, apologies for that dark note.
You are showing the reality, and we all should acknowledge that, especially the policymakers. I was wondering if there could be an international framework specifically dedicated to the protections of animals during disaster, similar to the Sendai framework for humans.
I personally think it would not be a good idea. I mean, I love the idea. I would love to have it, but not separately. I would want it to be a singular document, because the thing is, uh, that's how we operate. And that's unfortunate. So, as an animal rights organizations normally operate in the animal sphere, the human rights organizations operate in the human sphere, and the environmental organizations operate in the environmental sphere. What they really feel, you know, and don't understand is that it has to happen in a single sphere where all these values are coming together. And that's where we can create the most amount of synergy. And we would need, I mean, it would be harder. I agree. It's very utopian. I don't see it actually happening, but I think that's, if we do that, we will be able to include all these different notions or different lived experiences. Imagine if, somebody from Vanuatu is talking about traditional indigenous knowledge with someone from the American tribes in the US talking about the same topic. So there is something that's happening across the globe. Now imagine somebody working with the farm industry, with a fish farmer in Pakistan, with somebody in Latin America. So those conversations are really important, because the thing is, if we do them in our own silos, what we would end up creating is lots of sorry, that's a hard word. I will leave it out. So even I'm not a native English speaker, but so I have problems as well. But it would basically reduce a communication sphere that we all can use to advocate for the rights of all. So our goal should be the rights for everybody, not just animals, not just humans, not the environment, because that is the only way we will all thrive. That's what we need, and that's what interspecies justice really is. It's 10 steps ahead of One Health. So that would be my recommendation, actually.
Discussing about this with you and hearing you shared your perspective really got me thinking, and that's actually a great way to look at it. So, the co chair's statement at the APMC DRR emphasized the importance of multi sector collaborations between governments, the private sector, and civil society, which I think you've mentioned many times over the course of our discussions. So, the Asia for Animals Coalitions, as you are one of the members, know, works to facilitate collaborations between animal protections organizations across Asia. How do you think AFA can support organizations working together to improve policies for animals in disaster, both nationally and internationally? Are there any prior successful examples of such collaborations that you have seen in this regard?
So I'm going to make this conversation a little complicated. I apologize. But the thing is, the disaster risk reduction framework is not just a UN Sendai framework. It's actually very expansive. It includes every single treaty or, agreement or convention on environmental rights. It includes every single treaty that's about human rights advocacy as well. Because, for example, you might not have thought about this before, but the Paris Agreement is part of the DRR framework. The UNFCCC convention is part of the DRR framework as well. The UN SDG goals are part of the similar framework as well. And likewise, to ensure that human rights are actually realized in times of disaster and otherwise, these human rights treaties, such as the ICCPR, ICSCR, and the one on disability rights, right of children, and so on and so forth, are all part of this DRR framework. Because the thing is, without complete elimination of environmental risk, or making sure that human rights are not actually fully realized in times of disasters, we are not going to be able to create a holistic framework that acknowledges or makes sure that the rights of all these beings are, and particularly humans and animals, humans and the environment are realized. So within that same framework, animals are already a part of it because in the UN SDG goals 14 and 15 is about life on land and life on water, right? That's another collaborative area that we can use and talk in just in the SDG realm because we're discussing collaboration right now. We can talk about the IPCC work, and there have been some really good examples, which is one of them is, of course, the World Federation of Animals, which I know AFA is also working with, and other major organizations, which are basically, such as ProVeg International as well, who are basically working with the UN organizations or agencies on creating these green climate spaces because they're eliminating that environmental harm or that environmental carbon footprint. But at the same time, they're advocating for animals. So they're very creative. And you can pick any of these treaties at random and use that as a collaborative point to basically bring about these collaborations between governments, private sector, and civil society. So I do apologize for making this a bit messy, but normally when we think about DRR, we only think about the Sendai framework or anything that's linked to the UN DRR system. Well, that is completely untrue because everything is connected. And therefore, we can use any of these intersections as part of collaboration as well. So zoonotic diseases is something that's covered in some, health frameworks under the WHO. You can use that because they recently gave a resolution, I think 2 years ago, about One Health and research happening in that area. The research didn't happen, but at least the WHO, the UNEP, gave that resolution that One Health is a thing. You can use that. And so there's, I would say, a billion places for collaborations, but you need to see the whole framework then. And I've written a few papers on this topic. I'll share those with you later. They're already published, which talk about this holistic framework. And it's completely expanding, which is, good for us. We can use any of these to tap in and talk about animals. So the sky's the limit, actually. And I'm pretty sure you were not expecting this answer, but I just wanted to be more clear. And so there's a lot of space. And for the AFA, I mean, you already know a lot of experts. I think you should, consider developing a DRR for animals kind of coalition as well, because I think your ability to put people together is amazing. And having a common space to discuss these issues would definitely help animals and reduce disaster risk as well at the same time. So that would be my answer to you.
No, Altamush, I think that your answer sounds amazing. Actually, the thing is that I sometimes think in silo, like in particular areas of work, like, okay, so climate change, we work with UNFCCC, One Health with the WHO, and then quadripartite, and you name it. But today you managed to connect all the dots and make us really think of how to solve all these very interconnected problems in the environment, human health, animal health, and disaster risks. They're all connected, right? And I think that's a great puzzles that we're putting together in order to solve all of our problems. And organizations in the audience should also realize that we should not work in silo, and we should all collaborate, whether you're working on specific species, specific areas or not. And we can complement each other's work. So I would say that it's great answers, very realistic reply to my questions as well. So I was just wondering then, what are some of the challenges you would expect on in terms of collaborations, and how do you think we can overcome these?
So I think the first thing that we, before we even discuss animal inclusive PRR, we really need to have some kind of an understanding of what kind of framework you're working with. So in my previous answer, I told you that the PRR framework is actually very expansive. It's multifaceted, and there are so many areas of collaborations. That makes it messy, actually, because the thing is, and you have to make those connections, because if you somehow miss any one of them, you're basically going to create some kind of a harm for animals and the environment. And that is something we should not do, but it could happen as a result. So we need to be cognizant of that. And secondly, this is something I've already written. So I was able to create an animal disaster protection framework because if you don't have something like this, I'm not sure how are we going to, create policies or anything that is holistic enough or, across the board enough to help us understand what kind of framework we're working with. And it's a big framework, so I cannot explain it here. But the basic things it covers is like what's the why behind animal protection measure behind certain policies. This could be whether it's anthropocentric or you're trying to protect animals or not. Then the second thing is about are there any pro animal protection measures inside of it? That's where animal inclusive DRR can become part of it as well, because some measures are actually about directly protecting animals, farm animals, or any kind of animals. Then it's about seeing are there any risk increasing measures that already exist in that system that we would want to try to eliminate. Then it's about the status of animals at the legal system, because that's important because I'm a lawyer, but still people need to know like whether animals have some kind of a welfare protection status. Are they protected under the environment or are they just property? Because that kind of gives us what kind of language we're working with or how much narrow our scope is for introducing animal protections. Then secondly, because it's not just about international law, it's also about domestic law, and we will be working with states. And whenever we're proposing policies or collaboration on a state level, we also need to understand what kind of animals of specific protections exist in that domestic state itself as well. And it has to happen for different kind of animals. For example, farm animals, companion animals, lab animals, wild animals, liminal animals, aquatic animals. And lastly, we need to have some kind of framework, or if it already exists, perfect. If it doesn't, we have to create one, which is about stakeholder accountability, because we don't have something that's binding in DRR right now. If we don't have stakeholder accountability, we are actually don't have any kind of a mechanism to ensure that whatever we have written on paper is realized or not. So that's a framework I wrote about. It's published in two papers with the Global Journal of Animal Law and another one that's incoming. And I would love if we can have a look. But I think before we even start, we need to understand that. And based on that, we can develop policies. So yeah, I've done some of the work already for you, which I'll share. Happy to share.
I would love to receive all the documents you mentioned, Altamush, and I will hold you on to that promise. I would love to read all the documents you mentioned and share with the network as well. So I was wondering if you have any exciting plans for 2025, anything that you would like to share with us. I know that you have mentioned some, but it would be also exciting to hear about some of the other work outside the topics we have discussed for the past hour.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually quite a few things. I will start with the most major one. So next year in 2025, in January, I'm actually hosting Pakistan's first ever International Animal and Environmental Rights Conference. So the goal behind the conference is to create a national space for national dialogue for animal rights and environmental rights in Pakistan, and at the same time connect Pakistan with the global animal rights movement as well. Because as of right now, not many think that we should even consider collaborating with Pakistan as a nation on animal rights. And if we want to do it at a non-governmental level in Pakistan, who do we actually work with? And is there any space for advocating for animal rights in a nation like mine? So I'm trying to change that and hopefully create a movement. So it's happening on the 18th and 19th of January 2025 at Pearl Continental Hotel in Lahore, Pakistan. That's project number one. Project number two is I've started a film series, an animal law film advocacy series, and it's basically about the lives of animals. It's basically the first ever, footage or documentary or film shot in Pakistan that's completely local. So I made my first film, which was, released in Hanoi at the Veg Fest on October 12th. This was very well received. I will be happy to share a copy with you as well if it can, help us premiere it, if that's possible. And second film is on frogfish in Pakistan, which you might not even thought, like, how do you do that in Pakistan? So I'm working on that. It's been currently shot. It will come out next year. And the last thing I would just plug in is from in 2 days, actually, I'm teaching my country's first ever international disaster animal law class, an international animal law class, and an international environmental law class, which covers all of these modules in a singular course of public international law in Pakistan at the University of Central Punjab, 200 law students. So while I'm doing all this stuff, I'm teaching so we can create more agents of change in my country. And so, you can have more amazing leaders, way better than me, in a few years you can work with. So that's something I'm working on right now.
Altamush, I have a serious question. How do you balance all that? Like you work on so many projects, interspecies justice, you teach, you manage two organizations, you organize events, and now you also shoot movies. How do you balance your time to manage all that? And the most important question is how can the audience also connect all the dots like you do and just see things from all kinds of perspective and connect all them all together.
I don't think I have an answer to that. I just feel that this is kind of, my responsibility, and especially my mentors, both humans and non-humans, and always pushed me towards, doing all these things. Because I mentioned before, my greatest non-human mentor is my cat. So she's taught me everything, and I feel there's so much more to learn. And as responsible human beings, it's our responsibility towards everybody. And another area that I didn't mention is that I'm also working on creating a space for animal rights in Islam. So I'm happy to confirm a book of mine, of which I'm co-editing and writing on, will be published in a couple years by a very major uh, publication house, which is affiliated with the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics as well. So that's happening, and I'm trying to create a space for those 2 billion Muslims to think about animals, but from an Islamic perspective. So I think that's needed, and what I would say is that just keep on doing and making the world a better place for all life. That's the only advice that I have, and I don't think you need a reason to do any of this. I never had any reason, and I hope I can keep doing it. And right now, why I'm doing it is because I feel I will be old in a few years. So I'm just making sure my youthful energy is used in this area, and later I can just leave and then leave it to the other people to lead the movement, because I don't want to do this for life. So I'm doing everything right now.
Okay, okay. And you're under 30, yes?
Yeah, I'm under 30.
Mm, okay, okay. It's lovely to have these conversations, and also it's incredible actually to learn all about all of your initiatives and plans and upcoming work. And I sincerely hope that not just AFA but other AFA members and also organizations from outside of the movement actually could also contribute and collaborate with you on such meaningful endeavors. Altamush, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your invaluable insights on the intersections of animal rights, interspecies justice, and disaster risk reductions. Your work is truly inspiring, and I know our listeners have gained so much from this conversation. For those of you tuning in, if you want to learn more about Altamush's work, you can visit the Charities Doings Foundation's website or follow him on social media. Until next time, let's continue to advocate for the voiceless and make sure that both humans and animals are protected in the face of disaster. Altamush, you want to say goodbye to the audience?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, actually, in particular, because your support has been invaluable, at least for the last year. So thank you so much for existing, and thank you so much for being so kind, for sharing your time with me, and, just being such a wonderful person. And I'm really looking forward to, learning more from you and hopefully doing more good for the world as well. So thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, Altamush, and thanks for listening to the Asia for Animals podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you liked today's episode, please share it with your colleagues. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much, and until next time, bye bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.